think we are.
Hello. Hello.
Hello.
Hello. Yeah. Hello. My webcam is not responding now. It says that you stopped sending video because your webcam got disconnected.
What happened? We can't.
You can't hear me? Can you
We
hear
can
me?
hear you, but we can't see you, sir.
Yeah, it says a Cisco WebEx meeting. There's some technical issue. Oops. You're sending video. You stopped sending video because your webcam got disconnected. I don't know why.
Okay, so maybe we can just start without
Yeah.
the
Yeah. Yeah.
without.
Fine. Yeah. Yeah. You can then. I think we've started live streaming. Is it happening? Hello.
Yes, we are live.
Okay. Should we? Should we start?
Yes, yes.
Yeah. On On behalf of the Council of Architecture, the COA Social, I welcome you all, especially architect Sameer Kadora and architect Madhav Raman, to be a special guest for our dialogue today. This is ninth in the series of the Council of Architecture dialogues. And as we have been trying to attempt, this is an effort to bring in all architects of the fraternity around to know what the emerging architects are doing. And today we have a team of very young emerging architects with good experience and technical expertise. They have done all around, they've shown their impression all around the world. And I think this dialogue will give a new kind of perspective to the young architects who must be all live streaming. I welcome all the members of the Council of Architecture, the guests for the council, and the entire audience. I think we must have large number of young architects. I can't see how many of them because of some technical issues, but this dialogue will surely bring in new kind of perspective to the way these young architects are practicing and giving hope to the youngsters. Over to Apurva. I think she'll formally introduce both the architects and then they'll carry on with the dialogue.
Apurva, I think you're on mute. You need to.
You're muted. Apurva, you're muted.
Yes. A very good evening to all our viewers. I welcome you all to today's dialogue titled Practice in Hindsight 2020 in 2020. I'm sure, like me, all of you too find the title very intriguing. And that's precisely because our guests for today, who have been award-winning names in architecture, have been celebrated for their ideologies, processes, and designs that have hinged on innovative, explorative, and experimental interventions in architecture design. Sameep Padora, our first speaker, set up his practice, Sameep Padora and Associates, in 2007 in Mumbai. Sameep also runs a not-for-profit research arm, SPARE, that researches issues of urbanization in India. He is equally engaged and tied up in urban interventions in the city of Mumbai and is the co-founder of the Bandra Collective that engages with the design of public spaces in Mumbai. Joining him today is Madhav Raman, the co-founder of Anagram Architects, an architectural practice based in New Delhi, known for its commitment towards delivering deeply contextual designs that encourage sustainable lifestyles. Madhav has a special interest in culture histories, urban economics, urban ecologies, and new technologies. He has also been involved in writing, curating, and moderating discourses on architecture and design. Sameep and Madhav have been both appreciated for their critical thinking and reimagination of the role of architecture and design in cities. Apart from multiple award-winning designs and recognitions on global platforms, they have displayed committed involvement in academia and research initiatives. The synergy of having set up their practices in the early 2000s, staying rooted to the context, being vocal about their perceptions of the multifaceted role of architecture and design, is probably what binds Sameep's and Madhav's ideologies and informs how their practice has shaped up in these years. Today, they are going to take us through the diverse terrains that their practice has negotiated and navigated. On that note, let me welcome you, Sameep and Madhav, to today's COA Social Dialogue. But before I step back for you to begin the dialogue, I would like to mention that we will be taking questions from our viewers post the dialogue. So viewers, please do key in your questions in the YouTube chat box. Madhav, may I now request you to take this dialogue ahead from here?
Thank you so much, Apurva. Hi, Sameep. Well, to begin with, I'd like to thank Mr. Sethia for welcoming us here, and I'd like to also thank you for having engaged with both Sameep and me over the past 2 weeks to try and put this together. And finally, Sameep, because I think originally the idea was to have a conversation with Sameep, and he has very kindly allowed me to gate crash into this one. But having said that, even the past 2 weeks of discussing what we should talk about today has been interesting. And so what I've done is, since I feel this is going to be a fairly wide conversation, to both help the audience keep track of what we are saying, and more importantly for us, Mr. Sethia was very kind to tell us that we are young architects, but now I think we're getting to the point where memory fails us very often. So it'll be good to have some slides, but I'll remember to try and turn them off. But if Apurva, you feel the need to remind me, please don't let
Yes, I will do
my
that.
youth hold you back. So Sameep, let me first pull it out. Let me get this show on the road, as it were. Do let me know if everything is visible and clear, or if there's any problem.
Yeah, it's fine.
It's fine.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's start at the beginning, Sameep. When we first spoke about this, firstly, I must let the audience know that even without the COA playing such kind hosts to us, we do very often have conversations. And those conversations are very often exchanges of notes on what we see happening around us while we are conducting our practices. So on this opportunity of kind of being able to share perhaps snatches of those conversations with other architects who may or may not themselves find themselves in the same boat as us, we've decided to call this thing 2020 in 2020. And I think that's because in hindsight, when we look at the past, approximately 15 to 20 years in which we've kind of established and run our practices, there are some kind of key features about it. So I'll do a brief introduction and then we'll dive into the conversation. So I think the turn of the century around 99, 2000 was around the time when both you and I were at the kind of cusp of our education in architecture, and we were trying to kind of think about what was next. But at that same time, we kind of found ourselves at the kind of four things around us changed very drastically because of globalization. And these four things were, firstly, we all got introduced to the internet at that very point in time. So there was this globalized information that suddenly became accessible. And because of the internet, but because of generally globalization of media, we suddenly got a lot of exposure to images and imagery, including the image of an architect. Um, and of course, in terms of the idea of building and making and so on and so forth, there's a globalization of material. There were expositions that started happening and magazines that started taking over the media space that were linked to the idea of building. And finally, perhaps most importantly, the idea of technology or technological tools, both in practice and in making and building. So these were the kind of sudden kind of opening up of horizons that we witnessed. So I'd like to kind of anchor this around this idea about how perhaps you can start with telling all of us about how you started off your practice, landed in this unfamiliar terrain, and how you've tried to be locating your. I mean, let's start at the beginning first and let's see how it goes after that. So, what were you up to? What made you come back and decide to start practice?
So actually, I think I was very sure about the fact that I wanted to do architecture. Well, I had three kind of major interests: architecture, archaeology, and cinematography. So these were, I mean, what I was kind of debating doing. Eventually, I mean, I did architecture, and it was about the most surest that I was, at since then, because the thing is that when I joined architecture and I finished undergraduate studies here, um, I went for my master's almost immediately to SciArc in Los Angeles. And what was really, in some sense, for me, striking was the dramatic difference that you actually see. And this is, I mean, this is all pre-internet, right? I mean, in the sense, internet wasn't as prolific as it is, now. But yeah, I mean, and yet when I was at SciArc, I felt that there was something that didn't seem for me to make sense in the way that what I was learning there and what I had seen in India didn't seem to parry very well. At least I couldn't find the tools to actually make that connection. So after a semester, I kind of dropped out, came back to India, and went to work on this small little kind of resort in Manali, where I was pretty much staying myself and kind of drawing myself and building almost myself. But I think that kind of hands-on thing was incredible because it kind of situated what I thought of myself and what I actually was in very clear terms. And I think I stuck around for another, I think 2-3 years, and then went back to the States to do a kind of master's at the GSD at Harvard, where I studied, and then came back in 2007 and set up practice. But interesting thing also is that if when students ask me about setting up practice and things like that. Uh, in hindsight, since we are on this kind of topic, uh, I think it's probably the last thing you should do. It's the thing to do if you don't find other people with synergies similar to yours. If you already have, people that whose methods you like, whose thinking you like, I would strongly advocate to actually do that, because design is just a small kind of percentage of what practice involves, and it's so much of others. I mean, you know all this stuff, right? I mean, you have to do almost 90% other work in practice, and there's only about 10% of design, right? So
Yeah,
it's
I
yeah.
think that's
So
why
you should
architects keep
you should
saying
just
that
yeah, yeah.
we learn, you learn throughout your practice, but then that's essentially it just shows that
Which
architecture
is
doesn't expand to that scale, and a lot of times you have to operate.
which is why Madhav, you and I at 45 are still young.
Yeah, I'm gonna watch that space very closely to see when we go over the hill and suddenly we become experienced architects. Um, no, but it's interesting. So I'd say that in terms of how we started off at Anagram was actually what you are in hindsight advising people not to do, and I just want to kind of also state here, it's not like I would. You see, those were times when it was perhaps not easy for a young startup to start, but equally, notions of what all makes the economy turn was very, very different. So, in a sense, risk taking was a lot less risky then. If I recall, that was at that time around the mid 90s and early 2000 was a time when you would generally assume that if you were doing architecture, you would set up a practice. There was actually not too much that was available. Like if you were working for another practice, that was you were just biding your time before you started your own. And I think that in the past 20 years, the landscape has completely changed. I mean, uh, for example, the Architects Act doesn't seem as strong as it was in the early 2000s today. So even this idea of starting practice as a licensed architect is something to think about. But so these were the kind of troubles while setting up. But do you recall in your early years, what were the kind of projects that kept you going? What were the kinds of things, the kind of work that you would chase down? Because there was a lot of prospecting then. I must share that when I decided I wanted to be an architect, there was a lot more sitting around that I was doing in my mind, in my dreams, than actually what has transpired. There's very little sitting around that one does. So, what all did you get up to? What were the startings like?
So I think one of the things about the beginnings is that you're so kind of gung ho about just committing yourself to doing stuff that
Culting.
you pretty much you pretty much do whatever, man. I mean, so I did a small room interior. I did a couple of pavilions. So the thing is, you're so kind of keyed up about what is internal to the profession, which is really kind of being able to express skill, material through form and so on and so forth, that you're not really kind of worried about the outer goods that come in with
Yeah.
professional
You
practice. And
work for the little pats on the back, you know.
absolutely, absolutely. Sorry, Apurva, you wanted to say something?
Just a minute, sorry to stop the flow of the dialogue. By any chance, do you have two devices next to you? Because there's a echo that is coming when you're
No, I
speaking.
think Madhav, if you turn off your mic, is that better?
Oh, okay. Yeah, it's okay. Okay, fine. Please continue. Please continue.
Or use earphones, Madhav.
I can't, Samit, the hair gets in the way.
Thankfully, that's not a problem I have. But anyway.
I noticed the clear side and backs. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely, man. I was just worried that people might confuse you and me visually, so I said I get something diametrically opposite.
No, no. I think your backdrop convincingly takes care of that. But do carry on. You were, I think, pointing
Yeah,
out.
so it's so it was just about the fact that you're so kind of taken in by that initial momentum of finding a expression or a voice that what you're really kind of worried about or what you're really into is the kind of internal aspects of the profession, and you're kind of naive, and I think that really works, and I feel you should even as kind of advice to younger practitioners, you should hold on to that idealism, and it's as long as you can. I think that kind of helps, to keep focused. Don't give up criticality for the sake of, or don't give up being critical about what you're doing, but definitely hold on to the idealism as long as you can. But of course, it's also about values and stuff. So I think those initial days was really just, just trying to kind of find expression and kind of try and do as much as you can. Idealistic, kind of spending nights at the fabricator workshop in close to Abdul Street. But it was just a fantastic time to have that kind of energy of youth, and to find some place to put it, I think, was also critical.
And a lot of discoveries, right? So, was there any? I mean, I will completely concur with you. I mean, it was exhilarating to be kind of, like I said, adulting. Suddenly, you were making very serious decisions, and you were in a sense in charge of things suddenly, and those were exciting times. But uh, obviously there were challenges. But did you find any opportunities? Were there happy experiences? So I'll give you a choice of two things to do, and I'll try and match you step by step for step. So you could either tell me like an anecdotal, some kind of happy realization of being in charge of a practice, or starting your own thing, and a sort of an unhappy realization. So that is one thing that you can do, or you can be more academic about it and talk about challenges and opportunities. You can take your pick.
The thing is that I think when I was younger, I don't know how it was for you, but I was very sure of myself. You know, as you know, it's
Oh,
the
you're
ignorance of
not.
youth. No, yeah.
You're not
But
now.
the thing, no, I'm not actually. That's the thing that I think that's really interesting for me when I'm kind of talking about it in retrospect. That the older that I've actually become, or the more experienced, the greater is my doubt in the projects that we do, in the practice, in the way that we actually practice, the processes. So I think I don't know whether well, I think it's a good thing, quite frankly, and I think it allows us to be also watchful of what we are doing as we develop more skills, more tools to, in some sense, force what we believe onto a project. But when you're younger, and I think an interesting kind of anecdote, and there was this little hotel that we actually kind of did, like I was telling you earlier. We'd never done a hotel before. There was an existing building. There was no chance someone's going to give us a project like that. So I had the gentleman who owned the hotel come into my office, and I made a model for renovating that one particular part of that hotel, like doing new balconies, new room setups. And I like positioned the light exactly over it. I moved the model such that it was the best side of the the project, so on and so forth. So yeah, and it kind of worked. Huh? So I was like really happy the fact that I'd actually planned this entire kind of experience. And well, yeah. So I think that was good. But there have been other terrible kind of memories as well. But for instance, I once this is after I came back from the US, and I called up a friend of my dad's, who's a developer, and I told him that my dad gave me his number, and my dad told me that you talk to him on the phone and tell him that you come back and you won't work and all that. So yeah, sure, I'll do that. So I called up the guy, and I said, I want to come and show you my work. And I've worked in the US. I've worked on the tallest green skyscraper project. And I just want to show you what I'm doing, and if there's any work that we could do together, I'd love to. I don't need to see your project. I'm very happy. We're working Hafiz contract. I'm very happy. I don't need to see any more portfolios. So it's really. I mean, it was quite shattering that it didn't matter what you were or what you did. And in some sense, we're still at that point today, huh, where we're told that no, we are working at Hafiz. I mean, you guys are design
So,
architects.
actually, that's an interesting point you'll touch upon. Maybe we can expand upon it a little later in the conversation. And it is this idea that, while individual practices have formed and created themselves, perhaps prior to the 2000s, but there are those legacies of individual practices. But in a sense, the profession, or maybe the institutions that hold the profession together, are not being able to create a legacy for the profession. And so in a sense, if you are an entrepreneurial person and you are trying to kind of set up shop, as it were, um, the linkages to legacies that you have are limited to kind of saying that, oh, I had previously worked in this practice or for that office, so that you, in a sense, can kind of connect to a larger tradition of, the practice of architecture.
Yeah, I mean, I guess what happened, at least for us, the time that we actually came back, with liberalization, there was already a kind of massive amount of work that had gotten done or was in the process of getting done. We arrived, in some sense, towards the latter half of that. Uh, 2005, 2006 was, coming. And the other firms that were just before us had that opportunity to actually to kind of, put in their kind of feet and
Right.
really kind of make a presence. But what that also did was, I feel that the rate of change was so quick, so much influx of capital and work connected to capital that we weren't really kind of thinking through the project. So the guys who came just before us were at a point where they were trying to service this massive demand that there already was in due to this kind of liberalization, and I think that also set the tone for what was going to happen and what we would, in some sense, inherit and as systems of frameworks, institutional frameworks, the understanding of the profession at large, and in some sense struggle against that as well to try and now say that we want some of that mandate where we are not just servicing a demand but we are also questioning what the demand is.
Right. So actually, I mean, I'll completely, actually, I'll probably kind of agree and kind of expand a little bit about that. And that is that, and if with Apurva's permission, I'd just like to share the next slide. Um, and it is basically ideas that, there were already by the time we started. Let's say, and you're right, to say that we started in the early 2000s means that kind of got somewhere only by the middle to late 2000s. But there were already typologies of buildings. There was the mall type here. There was the mall type even in Bombay had only recently started. There were these notions that you could build much faster, and so projects could actually be much larger. But somehow in all this, there was a sort of a negotiated path. So perhaps, given that if I were to ask you to generally look at this slide and say, there's something to do with type, technology, scale, and speed, what would you want to kind of say that where did you, when you started, what was it like? And say a decade later, where do you find yourself going on these four fronts?
Well, I'm definitely interested in well, in all of those actually. I mean, what you kind of mentioned, type, scale, tech, speed. I think also they all have some sort of linkages as well, right? I mean, when you're looking at type, you're obviously kind of looking at a type within the kind of framework of scales. I mean, of course, we've kind of worked through type, tried to relook at type, whether it's been our religious buildings or it's been some of the institutional work that we've done, or even kind of houses or housing. Uh, but that reinvention has happened at a scale that is not as large. It's at a scale that's smaller, a little bit more intimate, and hence a little bit more malleable. But there are obviously some certain facilities that scale creates that we haven't been able to tap into as yet, but we are kind of working towards it, or we are at least at a mid-range, if I might kind of call it that. Um, so I think, in some sense, all of this stuff is linked. And really, for me as a kind of as a practice, I'm kind of also interested in this idea of type from the perspective that type represents, in some sense, evolution to a certain point. Very often, what happens with type is that it's viewed as a kind of frozen moment, which we then kind of assign to a kind of historic pedestal, beyond which there is either the kind of propagation of the image of that type, uh, or it's exactly that type being repeated. But I think also, uh, that this idea of questioning also comes to kind of address this notion of how critical is that type within what we kind of practice, within where we practice, how we practice. what the context of practice, but now context is also in some sense so varied because of the fact that you're obviously working in different parts of the country, but also you're sitting on knowledge networks that connect you globally, like you were talking about as well earlier. Context itself is now is very, very malleable. It's something that is almost now becoming ephemeral. I mean, which is something that 20 years ago none of us would have actually talked about. Context was really hard. It was off a site. It was off a place. It was off that resource. But what's happened is these global networks that we sit in now allow us to be able to modulate these kind of contingencies that we work within, and many times enriching what was this kind of local condition. And I think within that is a huge learning for it's been a huge learning for my practice as well, and I'm sure it has for yours too, and for our entire generation, quite frankly. So.
Yeah, I mean, so that actually the idea of even when one talks about technology, one is not necessarily talking about the technological tools that one uses, and there is, in fact, in the question of technology, this idea that actually carried forward from a time prior to us was this notion of craft. I mean, there's always been a conversation around craft in architecture, or as an insert, or this understanding of craft as a separate stream of thinking, which you can help yourself to every once in a while, but also to kind of look at technology at a more unilateral, at a more multilateral level, and to understand that the act of building involves some pretty kind of I mean, anything that involves creating something requires a technology, and therefore even so-called craft technologies need to be understood as technologies. And that's some place that between tech and speed, let's say, there are always questions that come up in practice in how one proceeds with a project. So having said that, I noticed that in your when you talk about your kind of practice, there's a lot of, you keep saying we, right? Now, when I say it, I legitimately say it because I have a partner. And I do know about the Bandra Collective. You and I have ourselves had conversations about working together, also called collaborating, and so on and so forth. So, what is it that you think makes sense for practices in architecture, specifically people who are looking forward to at least 20 more years of practice? What is it that is in it for us to hunt for common ground or to think about collectivizing practice in any form? And I'd be interested in hearing from you more on that. But why do you or I think that while these are individual motivations that got us to where we are, there is a sense of us having to kind of multilateralize how we go about things going forward?
Madhav, yeah, although I don't, we got where we are, I don't think through individual kind of forms of practice in any case. You yourself have kind of talked about those, your kind of modulated brick facade building, where it was a mason who actually was able to inform the kind of production of that project. And we've all had similar encounters where we've actually, in some sense, realized and acknowledged that the imperative to for a project to become more than the standard or the minimum is really only possible through this idea of working together, whether it's with a mason, whether it's with a carpenter, whether it's with other architects. So for me, actually, the entire kind of model of the kind of rock star architect who wakes up, draws this building, and it's built, and you can have this idea at night. You wake up in the morning and sketch it. It just doesn't. I mean, at least it's not the way that I've worked. And even though it's the way that we are actually taught architecture, we are actually taught that architects are the authors of the project, which is not completely true. I mean, it's actually the other end of the spectrum. You're really a small part of what actually produces a project. I mean, I'm not even getting into the political or the political economy of what creates a project. I'm just talking about just people attached to the profession who actually make the project possible. Um, so I think once you acknowledge the fact that it's any project is shared authorship, automatically you start looking for co-authors who would make the project better. Now, what that has meant is that we've ended up collaborating with people like Hunarshala, that we've worked with Philippe Bloch and his software from Switzerland. We've worked with the Bandra Collective, which is, now this is, I mean, can you imagine six architects working together, 20 years ago on a project, on a common project? So it's things like that. So I think the idea that if you leave your ego out of the project, yeah, if you leave your ego out of the entire engagement that you're going to go through, the potential is to do a project that's bigger than the sum of your individual capacity. And for me, that's extremely important. So I think I really enjoy the role of almost this kind of editorial role where you're looking at the various kind of strings that are there, and then kind of talking about how we can knit that entire how we can suture everything together. So yeah, I mean, that's really where I stand on that.
It's actually, I have a slightly more kind of academic understanding of it. It's and I've shared this with you earlier in earlier conversations. This idea of intellectual property. The fact that it is, after all, our internet connected information seeking generation, and this idea of exploitation of knowledge or exploitation of information that led to open source licenses and Wikipedia for that matter, collectively. Those notions perhaps were for us, but they're very much the zeitgeist of our times. And for us, it actually, the sense is that, whether it was a story that was just told to us, that architects told themselves, which, in our sense of creating a sort of a space for practice, or to, you kind of reinforce the fort walls and say, okay, this is how much agency you have to change society, and your Howard Rock sort of narratives. Whereas post globalization, and actually post the access to the internet, and information becoming something that you can put out as much as take away from, it kind of changed the reality for us, where we were kind of forced to kind of say that, look, we may not be ever in any situation, not just agents, but actually know enough to control an entire project. And therefore, you need to bring in people who can contribute not top down, but more laterally, and very early in the project conceptualization, as it were. But tell me something. There's always this issue of authorship you brought up, and combined authorship, and it's fine. I mean, you may not have a big ego, but you can't surely assume that about other people. So, what are your thoughts on uh, the ideas of giving credit, of people saying that, oh, this project is a copy of that project, when we are kind of oppressed as we are today with the idea of the image? I mean, now we have images coming at us Instagram speed. So there is, every second there are millions and millions of images, and therefore spaces being captured. But where do you think this is going to lead? Because finally, how do you say that how do you look at referencing in through your work? What do you reference? How do you go about thinking about it? What is a copy? What is not a copy? Is that even important?
Well, I think the question really is how do you look at a project? There is an inherent value to what you create, or at least what you attempt to do when you design a project. The image and the imageability of the project is still a kind of second question. You already know about the conversation that we've had this, and it's already public knowledge actually, on the National War Museum. and the entire kind of episode there, where I mean, it's already public information, so someone can kind of Google it. But the point here is that the idea of the image being a pivotal is something that's completely new. I mean, and that's in the sense that while we attribute a lot of importance to the image doesn't really carry enough validity when you actually look at it from a historic point of view. So let's say if you look at the work of someone like Archigram or Super Studio, where the image really was the project, right? And if you look at the kind of images that we produce for our work, which are renderings, today don't really have the same capacity to influence, discourse. I think we're at a point where there is a saturation of representation through renderings, where to find value, we probably need to look beyond, the kind of 3D Max renders that we see all over. How do you actually look at representation through the lens of being able to articulate value? So that is one aspect, which is about images and renderings. The second aspect, as we found out in the National War Museum, is that there is the ability to use, and I mean, of course, we can see this in media all the time, the ability to lie with data is so easy, you know. So taking the kind of museum issue for, just talking about that a little bit more, the fact that the guys whose image we were told was influencing our project themselves said that no, there is no influence, but it was still enough to be able to kind of throw the project off completely, which is which just talks about also as young practitioners how naive we are about the way that let's say the profession kind of acts itself out, and what does it take to actually to actually build substantially. It's just incredible that we consider. I mean, till this National War Museum experience, that we considered just talent and hard work to be everything. That karte jao. Acha, luck is separate, but just keep working hard and figure out, be honest about what you're doing and all of that, and you'll get there, right? But we all know how that works, and that's the reason why I was saying that while it's good to be idealistic, one shouldn't be naive. And yeah, it's just learnings, man. It's just learnings. So
Well, let me reel you away from the precipice of cynicism, Sameep.
I
Like,
told you, I told you, I've gotten a lot more doubtful as I've gotten older. So
no, but I see. I'll tell you what. I think that there is something to be said about the fact that naivete, or you want to call it wide-eyedness or something, has a certain magic to it when it operates unfettered and unpunished. Where your discoveries in naivete aren't hard on you. But I would also like to say that, I mean, the fact of the matter is, all these points that we're talking about need to rest on a certain quality of discourse that gets built around the practice of architecture, or the built around the architecture that we see around us around us anywhere. That discourse perhaps it's like yelling into a dark room. There is no light until switches are turned on. You are just going to hear sounds, and they won't make sense because you don't see it. But I do know of many other practices around the country who are approximately our vintage. Let's say I want to stop saying youth, but are as old as we are, who continue to against such disappointment, still continue to want to operate in these waters? Now, is that because we're just desperate for work? Or is there that vestige of some kind of idealism that still feels there is elbow room to operate? I'll give you a good example that, the Bandra collective, I know, for example, has been trying to do urban interventions, and it's a fairly, tightrope walk of negotiating local government, funds, local stakeholders, and it's a lot of load to put onto your practice, which in any case is not essentially part of a top-down system of operation. So we've had similar experiences. We've had projects on which we started work 10 years back that have gradually kind of ground up to some kind of fruition when you work with government. I must say that the point is that when we can actually operate within more local networks, that's when we find we have a lot more agency, and there is a lot more kind of return on the addition of value. It may not always be money, it may not always be project fees, but you do get to see some impact. And I do want you to spend some time to talk about this idea of scale in this context, that when you work with cities, we're not necessarily talking about grand city level, city front developments, or let's say vista developments, or riverfront, or coastal developments. We're talking about more neighborhood, more precinct oriented. And a question of context doesn't necessarily mean physical attributes of context, it means more community context. So what do you say is the kind of going forward? Are you looking at expanding scale of project? Do you still continue to believe in the small project? And is there some opportunity for us to evolve some better level discourse by operating at that kind of smaller scale projects, but for the city?
No, absolutely. I think our cities are so complex that and currently in Mumbai, Delhi, there are entire cities that operate between formal cities. And I think this idea of the interstitial city creates so many interesting conditions that have not been thought about at all. And I think the Banner Collective, for instance, is one such possibility for us to actually look at these conditions and then to find ways to address these various actors that can influence that. And also, I think it's interesting that you mentioned scale. That the city really is at a scale that is well beyond the scope of architecture. And I feel talking about I was when I was it sounded I was being pessimistic, but it wasn't really that. It was also about how within the way that we are trained, both at within school and in institutes, we're not really conditioned to understand the political economy of projects, right? Uh, for instance, we keep saying, politicians, are the ones kind of driving things down, or developers are the ones who are kind of the reason why our cities are suffering. But I mean, the fact is that politicians actually, I don't know who said this, but politicians are the guys who are downstream of culture, right? I mean, it's basically that kind of framework. And until we don't understand that, for instance, there is no way that we are going to be able to intervene in any substantial way within the city. So while our projects take 5 years, 10 years to build, if you're doing a large scale project, if you're doing a city project, the politician's kind of term of reference is 5 years, right? He needs to get re-elected. And within that kind of understanding, there is an ability, if you're able to kind of understand these, I'm just talking about the politician as one kind of influence, but within this, there are other actors as well. And if you're able to kind of start plugging in those kind of gaps to be able to see what these timeframes are, what these horizons are, I think there's a potential for us to be able to scale. And the thing is that there are so many actors that we as groups are very often talking, past each other at the horizon, right? We don't talk to each other. So it's really, I think, also being able to kind of negotiate that entire idea that there is a larger kind of context. There are more actors who are involved in the production of architecture, and if you have to kind of operate at scale, you'll have to address all of these actors. I mean, I definitely would like to do that. The Banner Collective is one format, but our other kind of associations that we are kind of on with Architecture Ed, with Abin. I mean, these are all efforts to be able to talk about this at a scale that is not limited to the capacity of what one practice has, but really kind of can build on the capacities of three or more practices. So.
Yeah, I mean, I think the fact that both of us or both our practices are kind of in love with their kind of urban context. We're kind of very invested in the cities that we are operating in. But equally, I think there's also a certain amount of healthy respect when we are operating outside these cities. I mean, obviously, one is more comfortable operating in one's own area of familiarity. But it's interesting you spoke about politicians, Sameep, and I think I'll put it out there. There was through our time in college or even in the early years of our practice, there was this understanding that actually architecture is wedded to the bureaucrat. And a lot of our processes within the profession have kind of oriented towards the bureaucracy and perhaps maybe it's ironical I'm saying this on a COA platform, but there is this notion that an institution necessarily has to be bureaucratic. I mean, the idea that the COAs got us on a platform together perhaps is a indication of things might evolve or change. But opportunities of undertaken uh, time frames happen to be 20-year brackets. The master plan and everything is thought of in that 2-decade-long time zone. And very often that is what actually reduces the agency of an architect. And what goes a begging in a city is actually insertions that are much more multilateral but at a much lower level. And you discover new partnerships in them. You find partnerships in other design practices, but you also find partnerships in other agencies, which perhaps in those contexts have more influence. They may be political, they could be global. Like on one of our projects for community sanitation, the project team was led by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. So there are other opportunities other than merely either the post-liberalization developer-led opportunity or the pre-liberalization bureaucrat-led opportunity. Uh, but what are your thoughts on your cities in general? Post-COVID, let's start with that, since all web-based platforms must do their hat off to COVID. So let's ask you, what do you think is happening in your city? What do you think will happen? Are we going to just go back? Are things going to change?
Well, yeah. So I think there are a couple of things that you spoke about that we might kind of want to unpack. One is the idea of the city and the architect's agency. I think there is in that. I strongly believe that we have to relook at the model of practice. This idea about a client coming to you and asking you to design a project and paying you a fee cannot be the only way to practice. Primarily because we are not able to address all of the kind of requirements that exist within any urban context. Many times, what I mean by that is many times you actually have to look at ways that you can produce your own product, where you actually are able to identify that the city actually needs this and that's something that's missing. And then you're able to kind of leverage various actors, various stakeholders to be able to create, an understanding of what needs to be done. Research ties into it strongly. So the research becomes a model of practice as well, as does the collective or the collaborative model. So I think the idea of the model of practice needs to be kind of relooked at. The second bit that you spoke about was the idea of COVID like disaster, right? What happens? What is the what? Where do you see architects being involved? And the point to that is that let's say if you take the 1898 plague of Bombay, uh, uh, the entire kind of approach to that was a spatial approach to remedy what was seen as derelict dwellings. So there were demolitions, there were new neighborhoods that sprung up with better light and ventilation, rules were invented, so on and so forth. So there is definitely a kind of a spatial connotation to COVID, or for that matter, anything that affects livability in our city. Now, how do we as architects address that? Because the frameworks lie beyond. I mean, no one asks us, or we are not in a position to advise what building codes with regards to light and ventilation should be when people are making DCRs or DPs, for that matter, right? So I think there needs to be, in some sense, also a self-evaluation where we have to talk about what are we bringing more than a kind of aesthetic value to a project. What is the real value that we can actually create? For that, we will also have to, in some sense, train ourselves to be able to perform beyond our comfort zones of this kind of aesthetic-based practice that we are actually being trained to do. So I think once we're able to take on that mantle, it's there that we have a possibility to kind of contribute in cases like we see today.
Absolutely. I think, see, that is where even a lot of times, wherever when I find that we struggle in practice, is that that's why I refer to it as the oppression of the image. Somehow we are supposed to perform to producing images. Whereas there are many other ways of telling stories. I mean, you wanted to be a cinematographer, I wanted to be a cartoonist when I was a kid. So, the idea that, in a sense, we are not image producers, but we are narrative builders. The idea that we are not necessarily engineers or technologists, but we are, in a sense, evangelical about technology. We are excited about technology. We do preach about thinking of new ways of doing things. Innovation, I mean, technology is a great realm for innovation. We are kind of deeply kind of hungry for understandings of what past relevances were or references were, and we're equally aware of the immediacy of what we are doing. So I think to kind of pose my final question, because I think we should also try and wrap up where we are kind of try and get this conversation to some kind of conclusion, get some questions, is that very often we find ourselves driven by the kind of needs of social motivations. Let's say maybe because of our training, we're taught that architecture is in the service of humans, and so therefore we have a more humanist approach to what motivates what we're doing. But equally, we're now finding in times of climate change that perhaps our best service to humanity is to actually think of everything other than the human being when we are building. So how do you locate yourself or your practice in this kind of push and pull? Sorry, these 2 points of equity and ecology. You'll have to unmute yourself.
Yeah, no, I completely agree with you that in some sense the kind of myopic nature of how we've actually looked at practice and what the potential of what architecture can do uh, is also kind of led us down this almost kind of uninformed tunnel where equity, ecology all seem to exist as extras beyond what we are supposed to do. Whereas, it could be argued that that really forms the kind of basis for any kind of practice, not just architecture, but any kind of spatial practice. So I would completely agree with you on that. And I think one way to also look at discourse is to be able to also simplify, just explain what we do. I know if I was, it's just funny, somebody asked me, what do you, you're an architect, what buildings have you designed? I'm kind of trying to see if I can encapsulate that in a way that's well, let's say understandable, right? I mean, so what is it? What is your specialization? We get asked very often, and I really don't know. I mean, I'm a generalist. I don't specialize. but it just sounds so
Do you
undervalued.
hashtag it well, Samit? Do you tweet? Are you on the gram? Do you
Yeah,
hashtag?
well, I am on Instagram, but I'm not very active. I'm on Twitter for news. This is all during COVID. I've actually kind of figured that Twitter is a good place to get news, but you also kind of get a lot of other stuff. And
No, it's the key
you know,
isn't. I'm going to tell you some geek speak on this. The key is metadata. So this thing of encapsulating or trying to kind of explain, it's a great exercise in condensation, but
yeah,
perhaps we are prevented by our own ambitions of what we want to do by saying that
true,
no, we can't encapsulate and
true.
present ourselves as specialists or as non-generalists.
True, true. But I also feel that it is a reality right now, and if we are not being able to communicate in a way that's comprehensible to the general public, we will still be sitting at discussions like this, talking to each other, preaching to the choir, almost as one would say it. But to be able to kind of address conversations beyond this forum and beyond this kind of within the profession, we will have to talk outside. And I feel for that, if it's Twitter, so be it. I can't do it obviously because I'm old, even though I'm young. The next generation should definitely do it. But you know what? I think we should also
Oh
kind
my
of
God, the next
we should
generation,
also, the next generation,
youth.
the next group of younger architects. I was actually expect this conversation became a lot more serious. I was kind of going the route of comedians in cars getting coffee, but this has turned out to be like a
You,
really
I
serious
tell you
talk.
what,
Yeah.
there's a term for it. It's called FOMO. The thing is that I have a feeling, had we been born even 5 or 10 years later than we were, uh, I find the life of a stand-up comic just as attractive as you do. But that's, I think, more to do with how we find ourselves today, because life can seem awesomely funny and tragic comic, if you like. So I think I think we may not be stand-up comics, but we're definitely tragic comics, in as much as we're practicing architecture. But no, so I don't mean to be serious, but I do also not want to waste the opportunity to kind of
Yeah,
uh,
yeah, of course, of course.
discuss points that are on a COA platform. Let's not lose
Yeah,
sight of the fact that we are on a platform that represents the profession of architecture. I mean, not represents, but in a sense controls the profession. It controls education, and in a sense, we should try and talk about what it is that we feel. Look at the next 20 years. We've spent 20 years in hindsight, spoken about what we've learned so far. But where do you see? Sorry. Where do you see this kind of? So I put down these four words again. Like, do you see yourself? What do you see profession being within practice, and what do you say is that if we are in the business of trade, let's say, because we are delivering on certain things for a certain amount of money, then we kind of started that discussion about equity and ecology in terms of value. But do you see this going anywhere? Do we need to have is that, are we begging for a moment of disruption, or is there a slow evolution way of going about practice in the next 20 years? What's your take on that?
so I think one point to kind of remember is that the COA is a platform that represents us, like you said, but it's also a platform that we will be an active part of 20 years down the line, and people and younger architects are going to look back at us and say that, what did you guys do, and what was the change that you brought, if you didn't agree with what was going on. But I really think that there is a need to relook at the institutional frameworks that our profession operates within, even the intra-professional frameworks, forget about what its kind of relations outside, and to really see if we are being able to address the profession at large is actually creating value for society at all. And if it's not, then the institutions, the educational institutions, the professional institutions have to sit down and see where we've lost that kind of mandate or that ability to be able to better society, and to find out what are the things that we need to change to enable that to happen. Some of us do that, through practice. But at the scale of the institution, if we need change that is at the level of the country or the region, it has to be a change. There has to be change at the level of the institutions as well.
Well, I also have a point of view on this in that, you know, life is unequal, right? And therefore, any sort of institution will create more inequality than necessarily solve problems. I look at the idea that, in a sense, we find ourselves dealing with erosions. Let's say there's a sort of sense that there's a lost territory in architectural practice that existed earlier. There seems to be a loss right now, and then we are now discussing, can that be reclaimed? So there is an erosion and a reclamation. You're from Mumbai, you understand reclamations. There's a reclamation. But equally, one could argue that that space was never ours. It was a misunderstood perspective. And actually, our job is to create resiliences rather than um, when we look at projects, the kind of things that we perhaps end user rapidly change and evolve. But right now, when we work on projects, a lot of the new types have to deal with these sorts of fragilities that exist. And to a fair amount, I feel that the value, other than just thinking about things like equity and ecology and society and cities and stuff, also needs to think about what we are doing to build resilience within society or what the world that we see around. Because we live in times that seem very, very fragile. You have to admit that. I felt a lot safer in the early 2000s than I do now. Or is that
You
still
also
age?
younger. No, I think it's also the fact that we're at a point where, unless if we have to actually try and effect, in any way, the condition that we see around us, it's this time. And I think there is this possibility that we might lose this moment if we do not act. And I think I think this anxiety also comes in some sense from that. The only thing that I kind of wonder is also the ability for us to as a profession, to be able to do what you just said, whether we can actually valorize society, whether we have the inherent capacity to do that at present, which is why I kind of went back to the idea that we have to look at reinforcing our institutes. Without that, any change is going to be, you fighting against, something that you think is wrong with society. And for it to actually be at scale, it has to be through institutions. I'm not saying institutions need to kind of guard or monitor stuff, but they definitely need to reinforce the capacity of what architecture can do.
To nurture, perhaps, much more than guard.
Yeah, absolutely. To
Because
nurture. I mean, there is the capacity of nurture can alter nature, right? I mean, that's in some sense. Yeah.
okay, yeah, that's early 60s you're quoting back there. But now, as the sun fades behind you on that spectacular view of Bombay that you gave us, and things darken, maybe Apurva, we can take some questions. How do you want to do this? Do you want me to read out questions? Will you be doing it?
What happened, Sameep and Madhav? Firstly, I must tell you that that was quite a riveting, engaging, yet such a fun dialogue with so many narratives. And I am so glad that we are not the only gender who gets so paranoid about age. So we are all smiling, hearing that. So for some reason, we were not able to get in questions from the audience due to some technical issues. But your dialogue did raise a few questions, which I thought I should ask you. And I'm hoping they're aligned to some thoughts that viewers might have wanted to ask you. So, after listening to your entire dialogue, I want to ask you, how tough is it being an architect, especially in India? Because, on one hand, to retain your creative license, you have to be free and experimental. You speak about letting go of your preconceived notions. But on the other hand, the fact is that architecture is considered to be an elitist profession here. So by default, it is robbed of all the power it can actually exercise at many layers of the society. And I think, Sameep, I also heard you saying that to build is actually a political act, and Madhav also mentioned the same today. So, what have been your experiences? How easy or how tough is it?
I think it's as easy as you want it to be. I mean, it's really what you kind of set up as an ambition for what you want to do, what you want architecture to do. If you want to kind of do a house, with four walls that has real estate for people to live in, yeah, that's possible. But if you want a house to be naturally ventilated, I'm just taking the most basic example that I can think of. That you want it to be, naturally ventilated. It should have natural light and so on. So I'm very comfortable without ACs and things like that. Then that's an ambition that you set up for yourself, right? And so it's and you make things tough for yourself as well, which is something that is really kind of I think subjective. But without that, there is no change. There is no change for the better. If you're not kind of aspiring to make, however small a difference to what has been the minimum standard, nothing changes. And I think if you want to do that, things are tough. But also, to be honest, when you're working in India, there is also so much that you have in terms of material resource that now has really become very limited when you actually look at projects. Or it's if it's available, it's available at very high costs in the Western world. So what you're actually able to do here is still figure out a way to modulate a project beyond taking various products and just putting a project together. So you have the potential to be able to look at a project a little bit more, let's say, I would say sensitively is not really what I was trying to kind of aim at, but yeah, sensitively, if, for the lack of a better word. Yeah, I don't know, Madhav, what do you think?
Look, I'll be honest. I didn't sign up for so the rigor that my education brought me into. I mean, unlike Sameep, I couldn't even rustle up the courage to do a master's. Uh, he's obviously a sucker for
And I
punishment.
went
So he
twice,
went
huh?
ahead, did one, did it for a year, took a break, went to some mountain, thought about it, and went ahead and did it again. So the thing is that I mean, look, it is torture, but I feel that, I mean, if one is looking at how tough life can be or how tough a profession can be, I mean, come on, there are many more, including professional wrestling where you're fighting, hand and limb in order to be relevant. At least Sameep and I haven't met ringside yet. There's still we still hang behind the idea of competitions, and we look forward to competitions with the enthusiasm of a wrestler, but perhaps with a little less physicality. I do that push your buttons about this, the returns on this toughness. Then those are what fundamentally need to motivate you. Now, I do think, and especially after today's conversation, that one needs to look at what Sameep said very carefully about modes of practice. I think there are now areas of practice that are perhaps tougher than setting up your own architectural design practice. There are areas of architectural writing. Apurva, you're familiar with that. There are areas of trying to do work in a completely informal scenario. There are practices, I know, very young practices who are trying to operate in very dangerously informal parts of the city. And that takes not just a certain toughness, it takes a genuine integrity and a sort of a ethical courage to operate in those spaces. There's always the question that I shouldn't be here talking about it, but it bears mention, is the idea of gender. I know for a fact that Sameep and I have spoken about it at times, but the idea of even where you collectivize project, this idea that if a personality leads a practice, then it kind of creates a cult of personality, which Sameep has always evinced that he's not a big fan of that. But sometimes it's not possible to prevent that from happening because of the way architecture is taught. Even in studio, it's very top down, and there's a certain reverence to the faculty board at times that is misplaced. So I would say, there is a lot that is tough, but there are also lots of shortcuts that have established themselves in practice now. The biggest shortcut or the biggest cop out that as architects we've done is we've allowed ourselves to create huge distances between the studio and the site, uh, purely out of a sort of intellectual laziness, I would say. We just didn't want to grapple with the way things were happening on site in a new way. So we just said, okay, fine, we'll just add layers and layers of project management and so on and so forth, and get done. Or we'll just rely on vendors supplying material with fixing details, and we can just prescribe it. So we've tried to get out of this toughness through shortcuts, and I think we won't really go anywhere if we want to create a sense of community around practice. If we want to say that we are all brothers and sisters practitioners. We look at other professional communities like the doctors, the lawyers. There's a certain sense that you're part of something that's larger than the sum of the sum of the parts. So I think that is how I would look at it. I'd say practice continues to be tough. It's tougher in other ways than the ones that we have chosen. So I don't think we should remain the benchmark of toughness anymore.
Okay, I think there was a lot of learning in what you said just now. You were also speaking about giving credits. You made a mention of it, so this is probably aligned to the same. Sameep, you also spoke about research as a form of practice, and research for some reason has been untapped in India to a great extent, probably at all levels, academic or professional. And there are only a handful of firms in India, who have this separate research firm. Do you think there is a possibility of an open source model by which research by architectural platforms could be shared across platforms? Do you think it's a feasible option in the Indian context where, we have no copyright laws, and that is the reason why everyone is probably hesitant about these open source models?
Yeah, I mean, I frankly don't think we are at a point where intellectual property, though that's actually Madhav's specialty, is, uh, is is mature enough to kind of look at research being open source. But I still feel that it shouldn't dissuade us from looking at this idea that research is, in some sense, a means to inform practice. That what's typically told to you is that what you learned in college, or research is one thing, but when you practice, it's different. But that's not necessarily true, right? I mean, it's imperative. I mean, it happens in other disciplines, right? That research is pivotal in the production of medicine, or in the way that technology is forwarded. So there is that close kind of tie-in between research and practice, and it's research that many times in other disciplines forwards practice, right? Pushes it onwards. But I think we don't really acknowledge that enough, and I feel that we first need a massive shift in our understanding that research is critical to reimagine the way that we practice architecture. And then we can actually talk about, or maybe simultaneously talk about IP and stuff like that. So
That's very true. I think I agree with you totally. And there was another thing that came up. You were speaking about collaborations in detail, and in fact, you put it very well that probably architects have an editorial role in any projects, and they have a very small part in any project. And I think in general, also, both of you have been very vocal about collaborations and about how different disciplines need to overlap in order to engage with our cities. Firstly, how feasible and how easy are these collaborative processes, especially in the Indian context, because we don't get to see as much collaborations as we would want to. And secondly, with this, this new kind of living, new kind of lives that we are going to be adapting, how does this affect this entire process and execution of these collaborations?
Well, I think there is no doubt in my mind whatsoever that without collaborations, we just cannot practice. There is, whatever we actually say, any building is a sum of collaborations between. Well, even if we take the strict definition of what traditional practice models are, I mean, you will need a structural engineer, you will need a MEP consultant. In any case, all of this is a collaboration, right? Now, what can you do with that collaboration beyond do the bare minimum, which is to coordinate, is to then start taking on a curatorial role where you are then starting to start to examine each person as an author, as a co-author, and not someone who's merely following directions. And the minute you allow for that kind of dialogue to exist, automatically it creates a far more enriched or a far more potent atmosphere to produce projects. And I mean, we've done this a number of times already, and of course, with the Banner Collective, with the Hunarshala, with Rhino Volt. I mean, it's just that I can't see any other way that this should happen. Not just within the discipline, but also with other disciplines to enrich what we actually build. Madhav?
I actually I'm slightly at odds with you here. Maybe I'm not. I'm just maybe looking at it a little differently. But the thing is that for the practice of building buildings or building architecture, I'm 100% with Sameep on this. But I think when you mentioned IPR earlier, I think we have to first understand where our IPR lies. It may not necessarily be proprietary to begin with. And a lot of times I feel that practice has a responsibility to kind of put together its own knowledge bank. Whether it chooses to keep it secret or share it is a next question. But we cannot look at our practice as a series of projects. Just like we cannot look at our buildings as a collection of square footage or acreage or budget. Those are very reductive terms of way of understanding practice today. At first, if we are able, we are perhaps, we operate in the world of real estate, but we are the people in real estate who don't have any way of creating capital on our own. We're not putting in money, we don't bring in land, we don't do any of those things. So for me, IPR has to first come from the architectural community understanding what its value is. How does that locate in a knowledge resource or an intellectual property? Debate whether that intellectual property is proprietary or should be open source, and not shy away from difficult questions on that front. You may understand that the work that a practice does is collaborative in its very DNA, but maybe writing a book on architecture isn't. Maybe the book format is perhaps just our initial discovery of how we want to communicate in text form what our notions or discourse on architecture is. Maybe there is another. There could be a video log, or there could be an Instagram account that decides it wants to be the most vocal architectural critic in the country. These are the grounds for architectural practice that are being prepared as we speak. So I think for me, the idea is right now just limited to finding where all one can create value, and then to rely on people who are better at it to work with you to kind of nurture that value and make it grow bigger than the sum of its parts. And I think what Sameep was referring to is that within these things we have to stop imagining consultants can only be a top-down sort of a one-way street. These consultants are actually collaborative if you can include them in those conversations.
Thank you. I think these conversations have been extremely fruitful, especially because you both have aligned architecture to so many different processes of writing, research, hardcore design. But I do hope we can continue these conversations at some later point of time because it's already 7:35 now. But Sameep, I must say that I am so glad that when we extended an invitation to you for this dialogue. You spoke about wanting to focus on the practice and not on the projects. This is something that Madhav also conveyed to me. I think we generally tend to forget the journeys, but this entire process of how things evolve and take a new shape is what is most important. And I think you have definitely inspired everyone with your thoughts today. Madhav, I must thank you for weaving the entire conversation so beautifully and bringing about the various modes and mediums of practice, and of course for very thoughtfully terming the vision of your practice as 2020, which is to refer to how acutely and how with great clarity you and Sameep envision your practices and your contribution to architecture design. With that, we will be wrapping up the dialogue now. And for the concluding note, I would like to invite Architect Sapna, Vice President of Council of Architecture and Chief Architect of Punjab, to share her thoughts. Sapna ma'am, are you here?
Hello, Apurva, am I audible?
Yes, ma'am, you are.
Thank you so much. Good evening, everyone. Good evening, Sameep and Madhav. Good evening. I was just listening and totally was in awe. I can just remembering few lines would like to share कि there's a saying which says खूब जमेगी मिल बैठेंगे जब दीवाने दो. So it reminds me when two persons passionate about architecture will come and sit and share together, the result will be wonderful. And that is what we have witnessed today. And thank you so much, for your insights regarding practice. And thank you so much, Samit, for taking out time, and Madhav for your apt questions, and for adding humor to whole dialogue. It was, Purva rightly said, it was a fun dialogue, and I really truly felt that, and I'm sure our audience must have enjoyed it and must have gained so much from your experiences. And thank you so much, and I'm sure we'll meet again soon. And I'm really truly honored to have you on this COA platform. And for our audience, thank you so much for supporting us. Apurva, how many audience we have today?
Ma'am, I will have to check. I am logged in through WebEx, so I will have to check and let you know later. But I am sure because everyone has got back to work. So even if we don't have a lot of live audience, we do have a lot of people who watch the dialogues again and again. And I'm sure it's been such an engaging dialogue today that people would love to come back and watch it. And thank you, Sapna ma'am. I think you put it very well. And thank you, Sameep, and thank you, Madhav, again, especially for accepting our invitation on COA Social. It's been an absolute pleasure having both of you here. And thank you to all our viewers who have joined us today. The endeavor of CAO Social Dialogues has been to get into stimulating conversations that have remained untapped. And we, the team at COA Social, as Sapna ma'am said, we are very humbled to see the support that we have been receiving from all of you. Our next dialogue is scheduled for 11th of September, and joining us will be architects Pushkar Kanbinde and Sandeep Shikre. Don't forget to tune in. Thank you, Sameep and Madhav, and
Thank
thank you.
you. Thank you.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Thank you all. Thank you so much.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure, and wishing all of you a great weekend ahead.
Yeah,
Thanks
thank
a
you.
lot. Bye. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.